Given the recent developments in AI generative fill in Photoshop and Lightroom, perhaps we need to be reminded that we've been doing much the same things manually for quite a number of years now, and they've actually become easier over time. Here I think is a good example where this seascape lacks a focal point. If only there was a person on those rocks just in the distance. Now, when we're shooting images like this, we need to take plenty of them because with moving water and slow shutter speeds, we can't predict the shapes we may get in the foreground. So it's always a good idea to have a number of different variants from which we can choose. Now, this is just one of a few images I shot at the time, but it does have some leading lines. Created in the moving water in the middle left and also down at the bottom right, we've got a natural lead right into where we would like a person or a centre of interest to be. So let's manipulate the image and put the person in. It's quick and easy to do. With the image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, I'm going to go to my crop tool because I need to crop and straighten this. One of my favourite ways is to put my cursor into that value box there and use the up and down arrows to line up that horizon until I think I've got it just about perfect. I always find I can seem to do this easier this way. Just bringing up the bottom of my crop just to line up that top rule of thirds line with the horizon. So we've got pretty good composition here. I'll hit the enter key. My next place to go is the auto setting on the right hand side in the basic edits. Because I know when I click this, the sliders that are moved here are not going to set me wrong. So what I do is I use these as a starting point. Doesn't mean I can't adjust them from here, it just gives me a good guidance on what sliders need to be changed. I'm going to begin with a little more colour with vibrance. I'm quite a fan of clarity. I may even bring the blacks down and the whites up a little bit more sparkle going into the middle of the image. But I'm now looking at the sky as the main weakness in this particular picture. So at this point I'm going to go to my masks, and remember the masks are driven by AI. Now we may think that the selection we should make is the sky, but I tend to go for a graduated mask. This one here, linear gradient it's called. Because whenever we change a sky, generally speaking, it does get lighter towards the horizon. That's the idea. So I'm going to click and drag. I'll allow that shading to just drop over to the white areas here. Not going to do any harm there if I darken this down. So let's take the highlights down. Let's take the exposure. I'm looking at the image all the time. Looking pretty good. And let's give this a little bit of clarity in the sky. Maybe back to the blacks now to give a bit more impact, and the whites. Making sure I don't go too far and make a change in the sky that doesn't balance with the rest of the image. Now I'd like to also change something on the left and the right, because if we look at the image now, we can see the weakness is on the left and on the right. So I'm going to turn to another linear gradient or another graduated mask, whatever we choose to call them. I can select that by touching the G key, and when I do, I can click and drag. A little bit of exposure, but not always exposure. Quite often it's blacks and whites that I find myself choosing, but I jump backwards and forwards to get the effect I'm looking for. Now, one of the things I really like about these masks is if I want to take an area like this down a little dark, but I don't want to spoil these nice areas of colour, then we can go over to this option and subtract, choose a brush, use the flow rate quite low, make the brush bigger or smaller with the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, and I can remove the darkness just in that particular area. So if I want to protect some of the tones, I can do that pretty easily. But when I'm looking at the sky, the top of the sky perhaps could do with another gradient. So let's give it another. Hit G again, click and drag. I'll tilt it a little bit to the right because we've got a white area or a lighter area up on the right. Once again, let's take the highlights down, exposure a little bit. But I think that's about as far as I'm willing to take it. But now I've got the weak area on the right. Let's touch the G key once again. And within a few moments, we've got a pretty well balanced image. Little raising of that. Now I'm going to go back to my basic tab because there are times when we just need to sit back and think for a moment. If we've got the time to do this, it always pays dividends if we can just stop and evaluate what we've done so far. If we can walk away from the computer and come back in a few minutes, generally speaking, it clears our mind and we can see things more clearly. But it's also a good idea sometimes to just look at where we started and what we've achieved so far. Now that looks pretty good. I've got those couple of smudges that I'd like to deal with, but I may even deal with those within Photoshop. What I'd like to do next is maybe give a little more shading via a mask to the corners and edges. And one of my favourite ways to do that is to choose the radial filter. Now we can do that with the J key, but we'll find it there, radial gradient. There's the reminder of the shortcut. And if we just double click on the picture's surface, the gradient will be created right in the center for us. And generally, I find that works for me most of the time, but of course we can adjust the edges now or after we've made the changes. But of course I want the outer edges affected, not the center as we have now. So touch the X key and it'll be inverted. So now I'm going to just drop the exposure down on the edges. Sometimes again I'll use a little bit of blacks and a little bit of whites to keep the contrast nice. And it just focuses our attention in the center of the image. While I was doing this, I thought perhaps it may be nice to just lighten the center part. So if we go to the radial mask, to the right of it, right click, we can duplicate this mask and invert it. So we're back to where he was a few moments ago, but what I'd like to do is just reduce the size of it, maybe stretch it out to something like that. Because here I'm going to just lift the tones a little bit, maybe a little more blacks and whites, and maybe even a little bit more saturation in the middle. Tiny changes, very personal, but there we have it. Now we've got quite a dark rock in the foreground, but it's got good detail on it. I did think about lightening that a little bit, but I'm not sure it really needs it. So what I'm going to concentrate on next is go into my basic tab. I'm just going to see if some of the new AI tools can deal with these little marks for me because they keep attracting my attention. So I'm going to go to this option, which is our healing brush, but content aware remove. Let's see how this copes because I did try this before I started recording and it didn't do a wonderful job. Didn't do a good job there, so Control Z. If you find it doesn't do a good job, try making the brush a lot bigger. That didn't do a great job either. And if that fails, switch to the old-fashioned healing brush because old-fashioned it may be now or becoming, but it still generally works pretty well. As you can see, I'm not getting very far here with these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with those in Photoshop. So I'm going to go and open this in Photoshop and we can deal with them there. Now to save a bit of video time, you can see I've zoomed into the top right corner and that little splodge that keeps attracting my attention. And I've made a very quick freehand selection of it. I'm going to go to my Edit, Content Aware Fill, and I'm going to use the Auto here. And as we can see, it's doing a pretty good job. I think I'm going to accept that. Sometimes it doesn't, and we need a touch of the healing brush, but I think we will probably get away with that repair there. And I've got another one here, so I think I'll do the same thing here. Edit, Content Aware Fill. If you feel there's a need to just give it 1 or 2 touches with the healing brush, then go ahead. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Control D will remove the selection, Control 0 will fit the image on screen. Now I'd like to do a little bit of strategic colour, maybe to emphasise those leading lines. So if I go to this option, which is my sponge tool, I've got it set to saturate from the top of the screen with a flow rate of about 10%. So what I can do here is to wipe my brush over these areas to enhance the colour as those lines point towards the subject that we're about to put in a moment or two. Now again, this is all going to be purely personal, how much we give and where the emphasis is, but you can see I'm trying to lead the way to where I'm going to place that person. One final thing before I move on and we cut the person out. You'll notice in the middle distance, or the foreground I suppose, little white areas in the sand. And another one down here. Now, they're natural, they're there, but they're catching the light and they're a little bit distracting. Very easy to deal with the healing brush. So just before I open up the image to cut out a person, I'm going to deal with those quick and simple. So there you can see the effect of dealing with just small distractions, and sometimes I think we underestimate the effect of those. In fact, while I'm talking, I can see one center at the bottom just above that big rock. Now, as you can see, I have opened up the image where I want to use one of those people. So what I think I'll do is to pick up my crop tool, and let's clear the values there because I just want to crop this guy here. And once I've got him selected or cropped like that, if I go to select subject, I think it's going to do a pretty good job. I'm looking at the selection, just making sure it looks okay. It does. So I'm going to hit Control C to copy, go to my image and hit Control V. Using the Move tool, I need to move this man into this sort of position, and straight away we can see that the problem we've got here is he's too big. Now, we're never quite sure what size image we actually want here. So to make sure that we don't make a mistake, what we could do with this layer is to create a smart object. If we go to the Layers menu, it's down here somewhere, there it is, Smart Objects, Convert to a Smart Object, you get a little symbol. All that's doing is it's going to allow me to make this man much smaller in the picture. But if I make an error, I can make him larger again without losing any quality. Because I may want to just check where the rule of third strong point is, and it's a little bit further to the left. So I want to move the man to the left a little bit, and I want to scale him at the same time. I'm going to do that with the free transform tool, but perhaps I'd better zoom in a bit. Otherwise he may be actually too small. Control T will bring up the free transform. I'm going to rotate him just a little bit as well. But then I'm going to drag the corner, and you can see what I mean about making him the right size. Do I want him standing right up there? Do I want him standing in the water? Well, we don't know until we actually hit the Enter key, hit Control 0, and then take a look, because then we can gauge if we've got him about the right size. Now, we can argue the point, but I think it's just about right. But if I got it wrong, he's a smart object and I could make him bigger or take him smaller, whatever. I feel is appropriate. The other thing I think it possibly needs is maybe a little darkening. Maybe we can see too much of the colour. So Control L brings up the levels, and I could just darken that guy down. Don't want him to be an absolute silhouette, but maybe it would be a little more silhouette-ish given the lighting conditions. Again, all personal choices. Now, it's not a bad idea to save this image as a Photoshop file, just in case you open it up tomorrow, look at it and decide you want to change the size of the figure you've put on the rock. Well, while it's in layers, that's very easy to do. It's amazing how the impact of an image can be changed just by the inclusion of a very small person or persons in the distance. Sometimes we get lucky and the added interest of people is there by pure chance, including the leading lines. Now, when we find scenes like this, we take advantage of them. But even though the person I've added in my original image is very small, he does provide us a focal point, and we can do this both easily and manually too. It also avoids any claims of unfair practices via AI generative fill. So, although we have added something to our image, it's all our own work. I'll see you next time.